In episode 1, we built a picture of the organization. Now we take the next step. We draw the line. And that line, the scope of the EMS, is not a technicality. It's one of the most consequential decisions in the entire system. In this episode, on defining the scope of the environmental management system under ISO 14001-2026, so I present my own reading of the changes to clause 4.3. And I believe that, for many people, this reading may sound unusual or even too demanding. I say that because it will not be the first time. So on other occasions, I have read the standard carefully, studied it in depth, tried to understand its logic, and arrived at interpretations that many people, in practice, considered excessive. At the same time, I could see that more basic, more comfortable, and less far-reaching interpretations were often enough to get organizations certified. And in those moments, there was never a shortage of people thinking or even saying, Carlos is overcomplicating things. But then, over time, new editions of the standard appear along with explanatory notes and clarifications, and it becomes clear that the direction was actually closer to what at first seemed too demanding. And that is the spirit in which I am publishing this episode, okay? Not as someone claiming to own the truth, okay, but as someone trying to read the standard seriously, deeply, and with a view to where it is going. So this is my interpretation of the changes to clause 4.3 on scope, okay? Will this actually become the dominant reading among certification bodies? Honestly, I doubt it, okay? There is a lot of competition between them, and when one certification body is more demanding than the market is willing to accept, okay, many companies simply move elsewhere, okay? Still, I think it is worth thinking about this more ambitiously, okay? Because one thing is the minimum that might pass. Something very different is what the standard seems to be genuinely trying to encourage, okay? So, let me show you how I think about scope. So if you read the standard from clause 4.1 to 4.3, it looks linear. Okay, first context, then interested parties, then scope. But I don't think that's how it works in practice, okay? I think scope, clause 4.3, is actually one of the starting points. Not the only one, but one of the first real decisions. And that's what this diagram is trying to show. Let's start here, scope. So when you define the scope, you are drawing a boundary, okay? So you are saying, this is where our environmental management system will make a difference. And the moment you draw that boundary, something interesting happens. You start to see the context differently. Because context is not abstract. Context depends on what you include. So if your scope is only inside the factory, your context will also be narrow. But if your scope includes outsourced activities, suppliers, or life cycle stages, then suddenly your context expands. So different risks, different dependencies, different environmental conditions. So in that sense, scope influences context. But it also works the other way around, okay? So interested parties, clause 4.2, also shape scope. So customers may expect something beyond the site. Regulators may focus on impacts that go beyond your fence line. Communities may react to things you thought were outside. So scope is not just what you choose, it's also what others expect you to take responsibility for. And then there is policy, okay? Clause 5.2, so environmental priorities, commitments. If your policy talks about sustainability, resource use, life cycle thinking, but your scope is very narrow, well, there is a mismatch. So policy also pushes scope outward. It creates tension, and that tension forces alignment. So, what you get is not a sequence, you get an iteration. Scope influences context, context influences scope. Interested parties influence both. Policy adds direction and pressure. And gradually, through this interaction, the system finds a boundary that is more coherent. Okay? And this is where the 2026 direction becomes more visible, because once your scope expands, everything downstream expands with it. So life cycle thinking becomes more relevant. So environmental aspects, clause 6.1.2, become broader. Risks and opportunities, clause 6.1.4, become more connected to real-world conditions. And operational control, clause 8.1, starts to include not just what you do, but what you influence. So for me, scope is not just a definition, it's a design decision. And more than that, so it's an iterative design decision. You don't define it once, you refine it, okay? Until it becomes defensible, coherent, and aligned with how the organization actually interacts with the environment. Okay? So take the same company, the Blue River Beverages. Okay? So you can define the scope in different ways. And all of them may look acceptable on paper, all of them may even pass an audit, but they will not produce the same system. Some will lead to a system that reflects reality, others will lead to something, let's say, narrower, safer, and less useful. Okay? And that is the tension, so we'll explore here today. Now, before we go deeper into scope, let me position this in the context of the 2026 revision. So if you read ISO 14001, 2026 quickly, you may think, not much has changed. And formally, that is true. The structure is the same, most requirements are familiar, but something important has shifted, okay? So the standard is now much clearer about the connections. That's why that scheme at the beginning, okay? Between context and decisions, between environmental conditions and operations, between life cycle thinking and responsibilities, and between influence and accountability. So what used to be easy to interpret loosely, okay, is now harder to justify loosely. The standard still gives flexibility, yes, but the expectation of coherence is higher. And that is exactly what we will see in scope. So you can still define different boundaries, but some boundaries are becoming harder and harder to defend, okay? So the requirement itself is simple. The organization must define and maintain the scope of the EMS and make it available. But what matters is not the sentence, it's the logic behind it. So the scope must be coherent with the context of the organization, the needs and expectations of interested parties, what the organization does, and what it can control or influence. And this is where the 2026 direction becomes important. So these are not boxes to tick. These are inputs that are expected to shape the scope in a consistent and justifiable way. So yes, the standard gives flexibility, but it does not give arbitrary freedom, okay? In practice, scope is often treated as a low-risk decision. So organizations copy what others have done. They keep the boundary tight. Okay? They avoid areas that are harder to manage or explain. And this creates a comfortable system. Okay? But comfort and credibility are not the same thing. And believe me, I have seen different certification bodies take very different approaches to what they accept as scope and to how much tolerance they show for drawing the boundaries for convenience, cropping the system boundaries to avoid complications. Yeah. Now, to make this practical, I want to present four distinct ways to define scope. Okay, these are not official categories. Okay, they are ways of thinking, and each one leads to a different EMS. Okay, let's see. Option one: fence line scope. This is the most traditional approach. Okay, the scope includes only what happens physically inside the site: production, utilities, storage, wastewater treatment, but only within the boundary of the plant. Everything outside is considered external. So this is simple, it's easy to manage, and it is often incomplete. Okay. This also is related with the size of the company, the power, okay, of the company in terms of influence, so multinational, okay, and small, medium enterprises with 15 people. That's very different, okay, very different. The power and influence in outside agents. So, as an example, this kind of statement is common. So, the EMS covers the production and storage of beverages at the Blue River plant. Okay, it's clear, it's concise, but now ask yourself, what is missing? Transport, outsourced warehousing, packaging suppliers, water-related dependencies beyond the site. Well, this is where limitations begin to appear. Option two, operational control. So in this approach, the scope includes everything the organization operates directly. So this may include multiple sites, utilities, and internal logistics. So it expands beyond the fence, but only to what the organization runs itself. But this is more complete, yes, but it still leaves out important external dependencies. Option three, control and influence, okay, according to the 2026 direction. So in many past implementations, scope was defined based on a simple idea. If we don't operate it, it's outside. That logic is becoming weaker. The more relevant question is, where does the organization actually shape environmental outcomes? Not only through operations, but through decisions. So, if Blue River defines packaging specifications, if it selects transport providers, if it sets requirements for outsourced warehousing, then it is already shaping environmental performance. And once that is true, excluding those areas is no longer neutral. It becomes a decision that needs to be justified. Now, let's make this concrete, okay? So, influence is not theoretical, okay? So, if you define specifications, you influence. If you select suppliers, you influence. If you include environmental clauses in contracts, you influence. If you monitor performance and take action, you influence. So the question is not, do we have full control? The question is, do we have the ability to shape outcomes? And in the 2026 direction, that distinction matters much more. Yeah, because once influence is real, simply excluding those activities from the EMS becomes harder to defend. Not impossible, but it must be explained. Yeah, that's why I think that some organizations will try to keep a simple scope and have another document where they explain the rationale behind the scope, and then, well, they are more detailed about the boundaries, okay, to present to the certification body, okay. It's an idea, okay. And the option four is the phased approach. So, okay, some organizations choose a phased approach. They start with a narrow scope, but not by accident. They do it consciously with a plan to explain later. So this can be a valid strategy. but only if the limitations are acknowledged and the path forward is clear. I must confess, I never saw this kind of approach with an environmental management system. I saw many cases already of this approach in quality management systems, like for example for hospitals, okay, where they start with one or two services and then they expand year after year, or certification cycle after certification cycle. Yeah. Now, so each option has trade-offs, okay? There is no universally correct answer, but there are more and less credible answers, okay, depending on the organization. So the more your scope reflects reality, the more useful your EMS becomes. It's simple. Now, let's return to Blue River. Think about what we discussed in episode 1. Seasonal warehousing is outsourced. Transport is outsourced. Packaging has environmental implications. Water is a critical dependency. So, if we ignore this, what kind of system are we building? So, here is a more credible scope statement. So, the environmental management system covers the blending, filling, storage, and dispatch of beverages at the Blue River plant, including on-site utilities, water use, wastewater pretreatment, and the environmental requirements applied to outsourced warehousing, transport, and primary packaging suppliers, where the organization can control or influence environmental performance. So, I think we'll have here some different opinions regarding this draft. Okay, yeah, I may agree that we can make perhaps the blue letters more simple, like a shorter text. Regarding the other part, regarding what is not traditional, okay, the outsourced and other things, well, that will depend in your negotiation with the certification body, I think. But that will be my approach, okay? My approach. So, this scope is not perfect. No scope is, okay? But it does 4 things. It reflects what a company actually does. It acknowledges the key dependencies, okay, the water. It includes areas where the company has influence, and it remains manageable. And that balance is what we are looking for. So the difference between these two statements, okay, is not just wording. It is visibility, okay? A narrow scope hides complexity. A stronger scope acknowledges it. But here is the real test. Can you defend your boundary? So if an auditor asks, why is transport excluded? Why are suppliers excluded? Why is outsourced warehousing excluded? Can you answer using context, interested parties, environmental relevance, or control or influence? So, this is the key transition to the next episodes. Scope is not isolated, okay? It determines what you will later identify as environmental aspects. It determines what risks and opportunities you'll consider. And it determines what operational controls you will design. So, if scope is narrow, everything that follows will also be narrow. Let me close with this idea. Scope is not just a boundary. It's a statement of responsibility. It answers a simple question. Where does the organization accept that its environmental management system should make a difference? Now, in episode 3, we will take this scope and move to the next step, understanding context and environmental conditions in a structured way.